Hi, good evening, and welcome to this Festival of Ideas event from the University of York. My name is Tom Hartley, and I'm a neuroscientist and senior lecturer in psychology based at the university, and I'll be chairing this event with our special guest, who I'll introduce in a moment. But before that, just a few technical issues. If you're watching live, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A button on your screen, which is going to be available throughout the event. What the speaker and I will probably do is we'll try and reserve as many questions as we can for towards the end of the session, when there'll be a bit more time for questions. So we'll save up some of the questions for towards the end. Should you have any technical issues, like you get disconnected or you lose your Wi-Fi, you should find that you're able to rejoin the event by using the link that you've already been provided with. So just reuse the same link again. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again. And you'll notice that subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So now to introduce our special guest today. Our guest this evening is Russell Poldrack. He's a world-leading neuroscientist and Albert Ray Lang Professor of Psychology at Stanford University in the USA, and he's joining us, I think, from California. So it's around noon for Russell right now, so good afternoon to him. As well as Hard to Break, Why Our Brains Make Habits Stick, he's also the author of The New Mind Readers, What Neuroimaging Can Tell Us and what neuroimaging can and cannot reveal about our thoughts. And I know from my own experience that Russell's research is really very influential and highly regarded within neuroscience. And he stands out in two ways. So first of all, whereas many neuroscientists focus on a specific part of the brain and a specific type of thought, Russell's work tends to look at the way that different brain systems interact and how different types of thought and behavior fit together. I hope this is accurate, Russell. You'll be able to tell us if I'm wrong. So he also looks at the links between neuroscience and psychology and the relationship between the mind and the brain. It's quite a distinctive, big picture kind of perspective that he has, and that's been very influential in our field. And secondly, unlike some other writers on the topic, and indeed some neuroscientists, Russell has a very careful and balanced view of experimental evidence. So he's not one for believing in hype or jumping to conclusions. And he's played a very important part, in fact, in helping to shore up the evidence base for neuroscience in the 21st century. So he really is a very authoritative person to talk to about the brain science of habits. And I'm delighted that we're able to talk to him this evening. And Russ, thanks so much for joining us. Can I start by asking you what I guess will seem like a fairly obvious question, but as I've been reading your book, I've realized it isn't that simple. So what is a habit?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. So what is a habit? I mean, the answer to that differs depending on who you ask. Scientists have a very specific way to, define what habits are. In general, we think about, I think about habits as basically our brain's way of sort of recording the things in the world that don't change so that we don't have to think about them as we go through life. Think about getting up in the morning and, going through your morning routine. You never consciously think, oh, now I have to go turn on the coffee maker. Now I have to put my cereal in the bowl and get a spoon. You just do those things sort of mindlessly because they're the same things that you've done over and over. And so, one of the important reasons we have those kind of habits is exactly because, if we didn't, we would spend our entire life agonizing over every little thing we have to do. So then how do we distinguish habits from things that aren't habits? Well, one of the ways that scientists think about this, and the way that in a lot of the research that I talk about in the book, the way that habits are defined is that they sort of become unmoored from the things that initially drove us to do the behavior. So, in general, when we ask, like, why do we do things in the world, right? Often we do things because we have a goal in mind, right? I go to the kitchen in the morning and get breakfast because I'm hungry, right? I go to work because I want to make my income, those sorts of things. But over time, some behaviors become sort of disconnected from the reward the whatever the goal was that we first engaged in. And we can see that in experimental studies by basically making the person, or actually in most cases sort of the rat or the mouse that's being studied, making them not care about the reward anymore. So let's say that we're studying how rats develop a habit, and the habit is just like pressing a lever to get some food. And at first they're going to do that because they're hungry and they know that the lever will give them food. But what is often seen in these studies is over time, the animal will just start pressing the lever, even if they don't want the food anymore. So let's say that we give them a bunch of food and we make them full, so they're not hungry anymore. They'll still go press the lever just as much as they would have if they were actually hungry. And that's part of why we think, habits become so difficult to break, is because taking away the reward doesn't get rid of the habit.
Right. And you're arguing that in a way, habits benefit us by taking away the need to think about things all the time. So they just free up something that would otherwise be unavailable. Is that a sensible way?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And people often think about either, quote unquote bad habits, quote unquote good habits. But one of the cases that I try to make in the book is that, those are kind of two ends of a spectrum. And, our lives are suffused with habits. If you try to think about like all the things you do every day without, mindlessly, without thinking about them, simply because you've done them before, when you're walking through your house, you don't think about what direction to turn to get from your bedroom to the kitchen. Right. And so habits are the things that let us basically sort of let our brain record all that stuff so we don't have to think about it. Unfortunately, in particular in our sort of the environment that we live in now, which is pretty different from the environment that our brains evolved in, there are, stimuli that can drive behaviors in really powerful ways that actually, kind of tap into exactly the brain systems that are involved in generating habits. So, that's why I think bad habits become not that bad habits, haven't existed through history, but I think they're increasingly powerful because of the ways that modern society, modern foods, modern drugs kind of tap directly into the brain's habit systems.
Another example I think you mentioned in the book, but it's really getting to me, is the telephone. I'm scrolling on I'm using social media and I'm scrolling on my phone the whole time. I noticed my thumb sort of automatically moves, and I once tried to give it up and I put it down and I promised myself I wouldn't look at it for half an hour, and a couple of seconds later I've started doing it again. So do you think those kind of technologies have been designed to kind of tap into this, or is it just a fluke?
I don't think it's a fluke. I mean, I don't know if they were, certainly people have argued that they have been explicitly designed to do this. I don't know if, the people at technology companies explicitly sat down and said, hey, we know this about how the habit system works. My guess is that it's probably more intuitive. They can sort of tell by the things that get adopted, which are powerful. Either way, it's clear that they have really powerful, that digital devices have captured a number of different aspects of that system, both the power of social information, the power of novelty, exactly that, the nature of the frequency with which we get that sort of feedback. All those things sort of add up to make these, very, very powerful devices to generate habits.
And I guess the companies that do the best job have the most users.
That's exactly right.
I was just kind of thinking about this definition. Can we draw a line clearly between what you might call a habit and something, for example, that we deliberately try and learn in that automatic way? So I'm trying to learn. It's been many years. I'm trying to learn how to play the guitar, and I do my guitar scales, and I kind of want to make it automatic, but it doesn't happen unless I keep trying. So that's a skill rather than a habit. But is there a clear-cut boundary between those two things?
Well, certainly when it comes to the brain systems that are involved, there's a lot of overlap. I think that the main difference is that, habits often are developed in the context, not always, but often developed in the context of rewards. Sometimes they're powerful rewards, sometimes they're, kind of not so powerful. But clearly a lot of the underlying machinery for how we develop skills and how we develop habits is the same. And it comes down to basically these circuits in the brain that go from the cerebral cortex, out here on the outside, down into the basal ganglia and back. And it's basically within those loops through the brain that both habits and skills are developed.
Yeah, so similar kind of mechanism underpinning the whole thing, but maybe kind of a different application or a different way that they arise in the first place. I sometimes had the feeling that I was tricking myself to form a habit in a way. Right. Now, you mentioned earlier on that part of the point of habits perhaps is to relieve us from having to think things through explicitly. And, and you mentioned in the book, and it's striking really when you think about habits, that you're not aware sometimes that it's going on. You're driving to work or something like that, and you find yourself, you come to your senses and you're suddenly there. So what role does this awareness play in the definition? Is it a defining characteristic of a habit? Because I also get the feeling that sometimes I am aware of the habit taking place.
I think for most scientists, the lack of awareness is not a defining feature. In part because that would make it difficult to study it in animals other than humans, right? Because we can't ask a rat, do you know you're pressing the lever? Yeah. But certainly, for decades, people have thought that it's definitely one of the central features of we often refer to behaviors as being automatic, right? That they're triggered without any sort of conscious awareness or involvement, and that's been thought to be one of the important features of habits. But I think for a lot of the researchers whose work I talk about in the book, that's not as important a feature as the fact that it becomes basically disconnected from the initial goal, the initial reason why we did the behavior.
So really the distinction is between sort of goal-directed behaviors on the one hand and habits and maybe skills on the other hand, but definitely the goal, whether you're doing something to achieve an explicit goal, is really a big part of that definition. Now, you mentioned earlier on that there are these different brain mechanisms involved, and I found it really fascinating and interesting and actually pretty complicated system to understand. But maybe we can say a little bit about some of the different parts of the brain that are involved in forming habits and also in goal-directed behavior. So people, I think, when they think of the brain, they can imagine a picture of the wrinkly outside surface of the brain, the cortex. But some of the parts that are involved in habits are less familiar to us. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about those different brain systems.
Yeah, that's right. So let's think about, how is it that we go about deciding what to do in the world? Let's say that I want to know, I'm at the store and I want to decide, do I pick up an apple or an orange, right? And so if we ask, what's going on in our brains when we do that, the idea is that there's a bunch of neurons out in that cerebral cortex, out in the outer part of the brain, that some of which are basically kind of voting for, if you will, for the apple. Others are voting for the orange, right? And they're all sending their votes down into this set of regions down in the middle of the brain called the basal ganglia. And what we've come to think about the role of the basal ganglia is that it's really kind of the center for selecting between the different things that we might do. So the idea is, there's input saying, get the apple. There's input saying, get the orange. And they're going to basically fight it out at the level of the basal ganglia. And one of them is going to win. Right. Ultimately. And those same places in the basal ganglia send signals back to where those initial signals came from in the cerebral cortex. And so you have these kind of, that's why I refer to them as loops. They're kind of like, talking to themselves, if you will, in a circle. And ultimately one of those loops becomes like the one that wins that particular competition. Right. So then the question is, like, how does that relate to habits, right? What would cause me to like habitually grab, let's say I decided to grab the banana in that case, what would cause me to come to habitually grab the banana? Well, let's say that I eat the banana, I grab the banana and I eat it and I really like it. So it turns out that when we have that kind of experience, the brain is going to release dopamine. The neurons in the brain that contain dopamine are going to send dopamine out, and the basal ganglia is the part of the brain that gets more dopamine input than any others. It's sort of bathed in dopamine. We can talk more about what exactly dopamine is telling the brain,
right.
But we know that whenever you get sort of an unexpected reward, dopamine gets released. And it turns out that dopamine is incredibly complicated, both in the brain and the rest of the body. But one of the things that dopamine does is it actually changes the strength of the connections between the neurons in those loops, such that the loop that wins, all the connections in that loop will become a little bit stronger, so that next time it has an even higher chance of winning.
Yeah.
And over time, that's basically how we think habits get ingrained, by those little changes in the strengths, the connections between the neurons, that make one behavior kind of more likely to win the competition than others.
So we already have the loops there before we learn any habit. The loop is already there for any action that we might do. So there must be a lot of different loops then, I'm guessing. And then we're just strengthening those loops when we get some sort of reward, so that it will win out over other actions, I guess.
Yeah.
So is it always the case that one action is taking the place of another action? When we have a habit, it's displacing other actions that could happen at the same time?
I think it depends on the situation. Some situations there are, like, the grocery store, there's obviously a lot of different actions you can take. In some situations, there's only, the world basically tells us, hey, this is the thing you should do. So there might not always be that kind of competition, but we think, especially when we're making choices in the world, that we generally have those kinds of competitions.
So if we've got competition between actions or habits, say they're well-established habits, it sounds from your description, and I think you do touch on this in the book, maybe you spend some time on it in the book. Is it possible to displace one habit by another one that so you've learned to respond in such and such a way, reach out for the banana, but now you want to teach yourself, in that situation, I've got to do something different? Is that how it works?
Yeah. So what we've learned about this, mostly from work, in studies of animals like rats and mice, is that there's something special. Like when you learn a habit, if it's like the first thing you learn in a situation, there's something special about that first learned behavior, that makes it almost become sort of like your default behavior in that situation. That's part of why habits are hard to change, because they become sort of like your brain's default. And so let's say that I had developed the habit of grabbing the banana, and now I decide I really want to change that. I really don't want to get bananas anymore. I want to, get oranges.
Yeah.
I can tell myself, I can have the goal of getting an orange. And, what happens there is, we think that the prefrontal cortex holds on to this information about wanting to get an orange and sends some signals that changes the decisions, the choices that we make. But the way that second behavior is learned is different than the first behavior in at least one particular way, which is that it's very context specific. So the idea is that, if let's say that I develop a habit of eating bananas, and that means that whatever grocery store I go to, I'm going to choose a banana. But if I now try to start, developing the habit of getting an orange, that habit of getting an orange is going to be much more closely tied to the specific, for example, the specific store where I learned that. There's a really interesting example comes from some research by Michelle Krask and her colleague. She's a psychologist at UCLA who studies phobias.
Right.
And you can think of a phobia as kind of like a habitual emotional response, right? It's like, and she studied spider phobias. So there are people who, whenever they see a spider, they get, really afraid. And she wanted to help them get over their spider phobia. So she brought them into the lab, and they had a tarantula first on the other side of the room. And over the course of some sort of exposure, she got people to the point where they can have the tarantula walking on their hand, right? So she really helped them kind of get over this initial, this spider phobia. She then brought them back some amount of time later, and she wanted to see how well does this last. Some of the people she brought back to exactly the same situation. You have the same person that they're interacting with, the same room. Others went to a different room, a different person they were interacting with. And even that tiny change led the people to to have more fear when they're in the different situation than when they had originally, sort of been exposed to the spider, than when they go back to the original situation. So that the idea is like, you can learn to overcome the phobia, but it's very it's really closely tied to the exact situation. And we think this is part of why treatment for anxiety disorders and phobias often will people will often relapse because they can kind of have a good treatment outcome in the in the therapist's office or in certain situations, but generalizing those to the rest of the world is much more challenging.
Right. So, and that's a case of something a little like a habit that's really tricky to break. From what you're saying, because the habits, the first form habits kind of gets a special advantage, and it makes me wonder about the role of habits in childhood and the first kind of habits that we form. It seems like there's a really important job for parents to try and make sure that their kids form really good habits.
Or at least don't form really bad ones.
Right.
No, I agree that there's a lot of pressure there.
Yeah. So I guess actually it's probably worth thinking, if you are a parent, what kinds of habits might my kids form in this situation that are going to become their default behaviors in the future. Probably I opened the fridge door too many times when I was a kid, and that's why I'm still stuck now. It's interesting that you mention phobias there as kind of an example of a habit gone wrong and leading to a mental disorder. Anxiety, you also mentioned. Are there other kind of mental disorders that are linked to habit formation or habit regulation?
Yeah, I think the clearest one is Tourette syndrome. So many people are familiar with this. We call it a tic disorder. So it's individuals who have like uncontrollable movements. So for example, an eye twitch or something like that. Usually starts in childhood. Most children grow out of it, but some number of adults, basically have tics throughout their life. There's an idea that's been around for a while that, in some ways, those tics are sort of like the habit system gone awry, that they're basically, that the individual, for some reason, whatever that might be, that, that they are what should just be kind of a regular behavior becomes habitual and becomes exaggerated. I think another good example, which is really less about habitual behavior and more about habitual thoughts, is obsessive compulsive disorder, where individuals they're unable to suppress particular thoughts or particular desires to engage in some particular behavior. And again, that's that shows how habits aren't just about the particular actions that we make or particular choices, but they can also extend out to thoughts and emotions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it relates to awareness, because you mentioned that the lack of awareness is characteristic, if not actually a defining feature. And I think about the kind of habits that I use in everyday life, like locking the door out when I go outside the house. And, I'm usually not 100 yards out of the house when I start to think, did I lock the door? And I think I've got, I need to go back and check whether I locked the door because I'm not aware. And it feels like that might be not dissimilar to the kinds of things that people with OCD report, worrying about whether they've completed some action that, maybe they ought to be able to be consciously sure that they have done it. But it feels like it's harder to do that with some habitual actions. Is there any link in that way?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm not an OCD expert, so I'm not sure what's been done in terms of like awareness in OCD. I mean, certainly on the flip side, in Tourette syndrome, one of the most important treatment factors is basically getting people to become aware of basically the both the things that trigger the tic and like when there are sort of signs when they feel like the tic is coming on. And then they'll often sort of train the person to do some other behavior in its place. And often that can have, kind of decent outcomes. But yeah, awareness, I think in terms of like, what do we know about the things that are important for overcoming a habit? And obviously we'll probably spend more time talking about this, throughout the session today. But I think that one of the clear ones is that, that before one can break a habit, one has to become, intensely aware of exactly how the habit works. Like what are the cues in the world that trigger the habit? What are the situations in which the habit comes about? And because that's the first, if you don't know when it's coming on, or you don't even know you're doing it, obviously it's very hard. I mean, I've had an interesting, over the last year, or I guess the last couple of years, I became aware of this habit that I have of like kind of chattering my teeth. I became aware of it because my dentist said, you're wearing down your enamel. You need to stop doing whatever you're doing. Right. And I really wasn't aware of it. And so it sort of feeds on itself, right? At first, you really have to kind of intently pay attention, and often you'll sort of find yourself doing it, and you're like, you have no idea how long you've been doing it, right? But over time, that in some sense, that attention also I wouldn't say it becomes a habit, but it becomes more prevalent and it becomes basically easier to become aware of the habits. But I think that could be, one of the most important aspects of changing habitual behavior, is sort of learning about your own habits.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this right at the beginning of this session, and also when I was preparing it, because when I started to read the book and think about habits, I wondered how much of my time I spend doing habitual action. Now, it's true that sometimes I wake up in the middle of I sort of become aware of the fact that I'm on autopilot, and I stop being on autopilot. But I don't know about the times when I didn't become aware of it and I just continued on autopilot. Maybe it's taking up a large percentage of my time. And I wonder if habits, in a way, you might look at the subject of your book. From the outside, perhaps it seems like a small part of human existence, but maybe it's one that we systematically discount because we just don't know what's going on. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that, habits are like an iceberg, and we only see the very tip of it, right? Because I mean, I would think that it's not so much that like habits are taking up your life, right? Habits are allowing you to go through your life and like think interesting thoughts rather than thinking about, like where to step next.
Yeah. Although speaking of interesting thoughts, you mentioned the idea that it could extend beyond actions and into thoughts. And I sometimes wonder whether I'm going around in circles with my thoughts because they're forming a kind of habitual links with one another. Is that phenomenon that's known to the scientists?
Well, certainly I don't know in terms of like, kind of the stream of consciousness. I'm not sure, like, the stream of thoughts. I don't know of work looking at that. I mean, certainly one of the things that we know about habits is that they also involve basically taking smaller bits of behavior and putting them together. We call this chunking, right? So that something that used to be a bunch of individual behaviors, like let's say, driving your car to work, at one point that, at the very first, you have to think about which pedal, you're learning how to drive. You have to think about which pedal to push. Then you have to think about which turn to make at which intersection, or, where to worry about a speed trap. At some point, the whole thing just becomes automated, right? Yeah. And so it's a really extended habit, even though it's kind of putting together lots of small habits. Yeah. And so that's really well established in kind of more sort of action behavior types of context. I don't know about in the context of thought.
Yeah, so it's fascinating how big or complex habits could become. And I wonder what the upper limit is. Is it possible to give a lecture or some very complex thing that involves taking decisions? I mean, can we go on to autopilot with quite complex forms of action?
It's a good question. And I don't know that, scientifically we've really mapped that out. I mean, there's certainly arguments, for example, that I talk about in the book, that goals can actually become habitual, right? That you can not so much have you cannot have a habit of like, grabbing a particular thing, but you can have the habit of, I want to get some cocaine, right?
Right.
And there's actually arguments in the addiction world right now about the degree to which, people have often thought about, addiction as being about bad habits, but the kinds of behaviors that addicted people engage in are often like really flexible and adaptive in the way that we don't think of habits. We usually think of habits as being like fixed behaviors that you've learned in a particular situation, right? And the kind of things that people go through, for example, to obtain drugs, are really highly flexible and creative. But the idea is that the habit isn't so much like those particular actions. The habit is obtaining the drug.
Right. And I guess that brings us on to the most important question, or one of the most important questions addressed in your book, which is how can you change your habits, and especially how can you break the habits that your brain has made so sticky for you, including things like addiction. What are the most important things that we can do if we want to break a habit?
Yeah. Well, I want to start by, I guess I'll start by saying a couple of things. One is that there's lots of books that have like the 7 easy tips for changing habits, right? And I try to take pains to point out that it doesn't work, right? There's no changing habits is hard because that's the way our brains are evolved. And so one of the really important points I think to walk away from the book with is that that we should be empathetic for people who have trouble changing habits, because it's not a personal failing. It's the way our brains are wired, right? So having said that, what do we know that's actually well established for changing habits? So I think, what I mentioned earlier about gaining sort of awareness of the triggers in particular, because we think of like habits are often things where some particular thing in the world, what we refer to as the triggers, that sort of, drives one to engage in a particular action. And so learning what the triggers are and then figuring out how to avoid them is really important. And sometimes that's easier said than done, right?
Right.
If it's, I know that the trigger is like I know that going to the bar is going to make me want to smoke. I cannot go to the bar, right? I can just decide I'm not going to the bar anymore. But if you have a habit that's triggered, for example, you have a social phobia that is triggered anytime you have to get up and speak, right, in public, and your job involves speaking in public, you can't just say, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so then you have to think about other ways to address that. But some of the things that we've learned, I think, are, one, once you identify the triggers, first think about how can you change your environment. There's some interesting work showing that one of the best ways to break a bad habit is actually to move to a different place. Wow. Because it changes your context enough that it basically gets rid of a lot of the triggers. There's actually really interesting work showing that people who, like a large number of people who came back from the Vietnam War who had been addicted to drugs, came back and never went on to do drugs. Obviously, they, some of them did, but a surprising number of them came back and never did drugs once they came back. And we think that's also because of the sort of, the contextual change. So then the next thing to think about is what will you do if you start to feel the habit coming on, or if you end up in a situation where the habit is going to be engaged. So there's an idea from psychology that's and there's good evidence that this actually works to help people change their behavior. It's called an implementation intention. The idea is like, what do I intend to do in a particular situation? So, and the one of the things we know about those is that the more specific, the better. So saying, well, if I end up in the bar, I'm not going to smoke, right? That's a pretty vague implementation intention. Whereas if you say, when I end up in the bar and my friend George comes and offers me a cigarette, I'm going to say, no, thanks, George. I'm trying to quit smoking for reasons X, Y, and Z. And so that's kind of planning for how is one going to actually, avoid or, sort of short circuit the habit seems to actually, be effective in helping people change behavior.
And I think you mentioned an idea about a sort of a penalty that you could kind of agree to put on yourself if you breached your own implementation intention. Is that right? That seems like it might be quite effective.
Yeah, well, so there are these ideas of commitment devices, which are basically, for example, I give somebody $500 and say, if I end up smoking, if you see me smoking, I want you to give this $500 to a charity that I vehemently oppose. Like we call it an anti-charity. And there is some work suggesting that those kind of commitment devices, particularly ones using that sort of anti-charity, actually do help people change their behavior. And it's probably because it it makes the, you can think about what's going on when you're trying to change the behavior as kind of like a battle between the habit system and the goal system, right? The goal system is trying to say, I really don't want to smoke, right? The habit system is saying, hey, smoke, 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 smoke. There's two things you can do, right? You can imagine pushing down the habit system. That's really hard. Or you can imagine pumping up the goal system. And we think that, these types of commitment devices probably sort of help push up the strength of the goal system.
That's really interesting. So some of these ideas that you sometimes see in movies, like an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other,
right.
It's not so far-fetched. We've got different parts of our brain, different mechanisms, trying to seize control. Maybe it's like a pilot and a co-pilot rather than one person grabbing the wheel. Is that fair enough?
Right. There's a lot of metaphors about, the human brain and how we should think about this. And there's really, both in economics and in psychology, there's really long-standing ideas of these kind of like two brains, right? The doer and the thinker, or system one and system two, and, Kahneman's framework. I think that those are, they're oversimplifications. I think that clearly there are different systems in the brain that drive us to do different things. I think that there's more than two for sure. There's a lot, and they're interacting with each other in really complicated ways. But it certainly is the case that that there's not kind of a unified decision maker. I mean, ultimately we end up making decisions, but those come out of the competition between lots of different, influences, some of which have to do with habits, some of which have to do with goals, some of which have to do with the environment and kind of the behaviors that it affords.
So I think coming towards the end of the questions that I have for you, and we'll turn over to the audience in a minute. But on that last point, I mean, there's this idea of Thinking Fast and Slow, a book by Daniel Kahneman that people may have read. And in that book, there are these two systems, one of which is a kind of quick and even lazy way of getting an answer without really thinking. And reading your book, it did make me think about the connection between those two systems. I mean, there's some overlap in the kind of habit system that you're talking about, and I think the kind of fast thinking system that is also blamed for a lot of thinking errors that we have. So we make bad decisions because we don't think them through properly. So we might buy a more expensive item from the shop, or we might choose the second best employee in the recruitment process because of a lazy habit we have of judging people in terms of stereotypes. And I think you've already touched on this in your previous comments, but I'm just wondering whether it's reasonable to think about habits as being, dangerous forms of quick and dirty forms of thinking that can cause problems with our decisions as well. Does that make sense? Or would you distinguish those two systems?
Well, I think I would say yes to both of those things. So I think that, it is the case that habits in some ways are a quick and dirty system for, trying to make it through the world. There are many different ways in which, people use shortcuts to get through the world, right? We're limited beings. We have limited mental capacity. And so, we sometimes engage in the kind of, mental shortcuts that people like Kahneman have talked about, that allow us to use minimal information, but we're making assumptions, right? So if somebody asks me how prevalent is crime in the US, and I think about, well, what have I heard about in the media lately in terms of crime? And I make my judgment based on that, right? That's assuming that the media is a valid indicator of crime. Similarly, habits are, make the assumption that the world is as it always has been, right? And they also kind of make the assumption that you're not short circuiting it, right? Because if you're dumping, if somebody's taking a stimulant, which methamphetamine or cocaine, which directly affects the dopamine system, that's sort of out of bounds for how the brain evolved to deal with the world. And so those, I think you're exactly right that they're probably relying on different brain systems to some degree, at least. But they are all basically ways for our brain to adapt to the fact that we have to do stuff in the world with limited information and limited sort of mental capacity.
And it's my impression that neuroscience and psychology is sort of always, in a way, always been aware of these things, because you think about things like Freud, and he was talking about the ego and the superego and the id, which bear some similarities to these systems, and also about the unconscious, which has to do with this unawareness thing. But at the same time, it's something that we've come to believe in on the basis of kind of stronger evidence, much more, and appreciate more in the last maybe 10 or 20 years. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there, a lot of work from different fields, from neuroscience, from psychology, from behavioral economics, has all been sort of, pointing us to understanding these different types of, shortcuts, and the way that, sort of less reflective type of, mental processes, end up causing us to do things that often work well, but sometimes cause us to make errors.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks very much. And I suppose that means that breaking bad habits could have a big implications for all sorts of things that we do, and maybe could help us do those things better. Now, I think we ought to perhaps take some questions from the audience now. There's quite a number of them that have been typed into our Q&A box, and I haven't been able to read them while you've been talking to them, but I'll take a look at some of them now and pick out some that perhaps we can answer, and maybe perhaps there'll be some duplicates, so I'll jump over those. Okay, so I'm going to try and... Okay, here, I don't know if you want to answer this one, but it seems quite interesting to me. What are your own bad habits, and how do you use these techniques to change them? Yeah. Nice question, well, whoever asked that.
I mean, the first thing to say is that, knowing the neuroscience doesn't necessarily make you any better at actually being able to change your behavior. But I think there, certainly, I think the thing that the two things that I have used. So what are some behaviors? Well, like, I mentioned the kind of teeth chattering. A number of years ago, I used to eat a pretty high carb diet, and at some point decided that I wanted to change the way that I ate, and basically kind of get rid of sugar and lots of carbs from my diet. And that was hard because sugar is so powerful, right?
Oh, yeah,
but certainly, thinking about I think the main thing that I did there was just thinking about how to change my environment, just making sure that the stuff never gets into the house. Because once it gets into the house, then it's too easy to come up with an excuse to eat it, right?
Yeah, I definitely find that approach. Don't let it get in the house. Don't go in the shop and buy it. Those have helped me with some bad habits. I'm not going to reveal mine. There's another question which is kind of linked to this. I'll paraphrase it a little bit. The question says, what about habits that make you withdraw from contact with the rest of the world? And one reason why this is interesting, I guess, because you've talked a little bit about context. And of course, we're all in a different context right now where we're isolated. Mm-hmm. Perhaps as we begin, perhaps if we are able to come out of the lockdown situation, we'll be in an opportunity to change context and change some of our habits. But how does it work when you have got the habit of withdrawing from the world, so you're not able to experience things that might change your habits?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, the short answer is I don't think we really know, because it's such a novel, kind of societal experiment, at least for our generation. And, since we've been doing the kind of psychological science that we do now, I think, for most people, I think we will be surprised. I mean, we went out to a restaurant, when had dinner with friends a few weeks ago for the first time in, well over a year. And I was actually surprised at how easy it was and how very quickly we slipped into just basically being, like we were in the old days. In fact, at some point I needed to go to the restroom, and I completely forgot to grab a mask. And I got halfway to the bathroom. I'm like, oh, wait, I'm supposed to be wearing a mask.
Right.
And so I think, for many people, they're going to find actually that, that the needle moves back to where it was pretty quickly. But there also, I think, are going to be, there certainly are going to be some people for whom this has become, a really deeply ingrained new normal. And I think it's, it could be, it could be challenging, but I think that we can all sort of hopefully rely on the fact that our first learned behaviors are so strong.
I guess I was thinking as well, and the question seems to, I don't know if things like agoraphobia. So you mentioned the phobia of spiders and so on, and you can change your environment, and perhaps you'll be able to change your habits. But if your habit is staying in the same environment, it must make it really difficult to unlearn that kind of problem.
I would think so. Yeah, I don't know enough about agoraphobia to say much, but I would imagine that's the case. Yeah.
Okay. Next question here is: do reward charts work as a learning tool in school? Can children maintain a good habit after the reward disappears? So I guess this is where you're getting a star stuck on a chart in class as a way of rewarding you.
Okay, right. I was going to ask what a reward chat is. I think that's a Britishism, right?
I think that may be a typo, but I think that's what Anna is asking in the question.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's interesting. So there's actually some work there in the context of addictions. There is something that's used called contingency management, where you basically pay the person not to use the stuff, right? Not to smoke or not to use the drug or whatever. And it works really well as long as you keep paying them. And so once you stop paying them, there's good evidence that these programs basically that adherence falls off relatively quickly once the reward stops coming. So in general, I think it can be a good tool in the context of other things, but it certainly on its own is not probably going to necessarily fix the problems.
I'm just skipping through a few of these, try and find out the ones that are more directly related to what's in the book. It's an interesting point here. Okay, so a strategy that's suggested. Richard Osman apparently screams when he locks the door so that he can more easily remember screaming than locking the door. So, yeah, I mean, this relates to this issue of awareness. I'm not sure how important it is for habits, but yeah, when you've got automated behaviors and you want to make sure that you do leave an explicit trace, are there some strategies that we can use that might help us control and regulate our use of habits? Because I guess that's really what a lot of this is all about, isn't it? Taking control.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would worry that strategy just leaves you like, being unable to remember that you locked the door and having your neighbors think you're losing it because you're screaming at the front door. I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but the one thing that comes to mind is that, to the degree that one could try to develop like some trigger before. So let's say, you're leaving the house, developing a trigger that tells you, hey, I need to pay attention to locking the door. Right.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that will allow that. And the problem is it's really hard to do that, right? Anything that we do that often, it just becomes very hard to not have it become habitual. Fortunately, at least like in our house, we have an app that tells us whether our door is locked. So if I get, 3 blocks from the house, I can look and see. So, technology has saved us in that case.
That sounds good. Amy asks, is there any truth in the idea that it takes a month or so to form a new habit? Or perhaps another way to ask it is, what's the quickest or the slowest that we can form habits? What are the kind of limits there?
Right. So this idea that I think that the initial idea was it was like 21 days, which basically it came from this book called Psycho-Cybernetics, kind of like a pseudo-psychology book from a number of decades ago. And there really wasn't any data behind it. There's been some research published in the last decade that's looked at, basically followed people who wanted to create a good habit and looked at how long it takes them. And the short answer is there's a big range. Some people might do it in 2 weeks. Some people might take 6 months. So there's no like simple number of like, you need to do it for this long. And I don't think we know. I mean, there's almost certainly going to be differences between people in terms of like, some people are going to develop habits more quickly than others, but I don't know of good science that kind of pulls that apart yet. So I think that's some interesting science to be done.
Yeah, I certainly find it interesting doing these guitar scales. It's taking a very long time to learn them, and I become aware of how the habit is changing. The fingers seem to be moving by themselves, and it's quite a good thing when it happens. It takes a long time. Yeah. Steve's question is really interesting and probably something I should have asked about before, because we skipped over dopamine quite quickly in the earlier discussion. It's a complex topic, and one that you know a lot about and actually explain really nicely in the book. But Steve is asking about how would Parkinson's disease rate as a habitual disease? I mean, Parkinson's does affect habit forming, I think, in some way.
Yeah. No, there's two ways to answer this. The one is like, what happens to habit formation in Parkinson's disease? And at least, well, we know there's really clear evidence that the development of skills, both cognitive and more kind of motor skills, are impaired in people with Parkinson's disease, and that fits with this idea of habits relying on skills and habits relying on dopamine. There's also evidence that individuals with Parkinson's disease have trouble, particularly learning from reward. They don't have trouble learning from punishment, but they have trouble learning from reward. And that's the idea that, you need dopamine to kind of learn from reward. So there's a lot of evidence that, that Parkinson's does have various deficits in, habit and reward learning. On the other hand, and I talked about this actually in my previous book, there's some really interesting phenomena that happen when people take particular classes of drugs that are used to treat Parkinson's disease. Right. So these are these drugs called dopamine agonists that basically try to turn on the dopamine system. And a subset of people who take those drugs basically find themselves developing strange new habits. Sometimes they're bad, like, people become gambling addicts. I once met a person who was an architect. I met him on an airplane and we started chatting. And I told him I'm a neuroscientist. He told me he has Parkinson's disease. And he started telling me how he became addicted to gardening when he started taking one of these dopamine agonists. So it's very clear that turning up the dopamine system can really, kind of turn up habit formation, even around things that you wouldn't expect to become habitual.
And I think I'm right in saying that in the book, you associate the dopamine system with unexpected rewards as well.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a common idea that, dopamine is kind of like the feel-good chemical, or the dopamine is all about rewards. And dopamine certainly is released in the brain when you experience an unexpected reward. But dopamine is really more about sort of prediction and really telling us, like, is the world better than we expected it to be? Now, sometimes if I somebody walks up to me on the street and gives me $10, that's an unexpected reward. The world is better than I expected it to be. And so I'm going to, dopamine is going to be released. But, if let's say that person 5 days in a row, every time I see them on the street, gives me the $10. Now what's going to happen is when I first see the person, now my dopamine neurons are going to fire, because that's a predictive signal that I'm going to be getting reward. When I actually get the $10, they're not really going to fire at all, any more than they would usually be firing, because that reward is totally predicted by the fact that I saw the person down the street. So it's this idea of reward prediction error is what sort of dopamine is really signaling. And that's the thing that's basically telling us, like, whatever you were doing, that's why we think it's involved in habits, because it's basically saying, whatever it is that you just did, that was good, so do it again.
Right. And it's new and good. So it's not something you already knew how to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as we were just talking about Parkinson's, the other illness that is relevant to this is Huntington's disease, which you talk a little bit about also in the book. They have different effects on dopamine and they have different effects on the habit system. Can you say a little bit about Huntington's disease?
Yeah. So Huntington's is a relatively rare, fortunately, genetic disease that causes a degeneration of particular sets of neurons in the basal ganglia. It ultimately has lots of different effects. But some of the earliest symptoms are basically sort of the opposite of Parkinson's disease. So the symptoms of Parkinson's disease are sort of, rigidity and tremors. Individuals with Huntington's disease have basically uncontrollable movements. So they lose the ability to control themselves. And it has to do, and I go into some detail in the book about basically there's one of the ways in which dopamine is really complicated is that there are different types of receptors for dopamine on different cells that have different effects. So there's different pathways in the basal ganglia. One of them responds to dopamine by turning up its activity. Another responds to dopamine by turning down its activity. And Huntington's disease affects that particular one that gets turned down, and it basically results in sort of actions not being sort of stoppable.
because part of the habit system is to stop us emitting an action without an inappropriate time, or when another action is being performed. Because I think I remember reading as well in the book, which struck me as very interesting, that one of these systems is active at the beginning and the end of the action to kind of turn it on or off. And sounded like at that moment when we stop an action, there's a possibility that it could just continue or something like that. Does that ever happen?
That's interesting. I mean, I guess you can think about like action slips in the world, when people basically, like you go to the bathroom to wash your hands and end up like, brushing your teeth and putting on your pajamas, right? Those kind of action slips do happen. And that's probably, an example of that kind of, we think of like, the activity in the basal ganglia kind of bookends the habit, right? It happens at the beginning, it happens at the end. And, in order to like break the habit in the middle, other brain systems have to kind of, intervene.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. One of the things I kind of noticed in my life, as I'm getting older, I want to form good habits for things that I find difficult to remember. I know I'm not as old as all of that, but sometimes I forget silly things, and I want to start forming habits in that way. But like you say, you do sometimes get captured by something in the environment that just drives you to do something. It feels a bit like it happens more as you get older as well. Here's another few questions. So what about a habit that you don't really want to stop, but you feel like you need to quit because of social pressure? And this reminds me of a phrase that you used in the book, which I didn't quite understand actually, when you said you compared the difference between wanting and liking or something like that. So are there different kinds of habits in terms of things that you really want to do or things that you have to do, and how we can disengage from them?
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, in general, we think of the role of dopamine as being much more about what you just called wanting, right? Rather than liking. Dopamine doesn't seem to be responsible for the pleasure that we feel. But how this relates to, I guess there's a couple ways to unpack that question, because part of it's about like social pressure, right?
Yeah.
And part of it is about this distinction between like, why it is that you want to change, right? Or it maybe that you don't really want to change, but you feel pressure from the outside world to change. It could be that it could be that social pressure is just basically saying, we don't like you doing that. Or it could be knowledge that like, you want to stop smoking because that smoking has bad, health impacts, even though you really like smoking. I don't think most, habitual smokers actually get a lot of enjoyment out of the smoking. They mostly do it because it's become a habit. But there are certainly some habits that, it's like I drink wine most evenings, and I like drinking wine. And I, the research probably tells me that I drink a little bit more wine than I should, statistically, to be, maximally healthy, but I like it. And so, I'm going to continue doing that until it, has some sort of, obvious negative effect. So I think it's really challenging to know how to pick apart all the reasons why people might want to change behavior. Yeah.
And maybe there are different interventions for those different reasons. I see that we've run out of time. So thanks so much for telling us such a lot about such a fascinating topic. Really appreciate it. And I expect some people will be interested in reading your book. And I'm sorry to those people who asked questions that we didn't get around to, but thanks very much for all of the questions. So just a few things to mention before the end of the session. The recording of this event is going to be made available on the festival's YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again session of the festival website after the 20th of June. And you'll be contacted by email when that video is ready for you. And if you'd like to buy a copy of Russell's book, copies are available of Hard to Break with signed book plates from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And for more information about that, please also head to the festival website or direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. And by the way, Festival of Ideas is festival-of-ideas. We very much hope that you will all continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas. Check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com for full details of the other events that are happening. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and ideas about what to do in the future so that we can continue these conversations. So please feel free to chip into the conversation on social media with the hashtag #YorkIdeas. Just like to finish off by saying thanks again to our wonderful guest, Russell Poldrack. Thanks so much for telling us about habits. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, it was my pleasure.